Yeah, hi. Good evening, everyone. On the last in the last class, we had briefly gone through the fundamental characteristics of the arbitration regime in the country, and we had taken a look at not only the broad contours of what the system represents, but also the relative merits and demerits of contemporary arbitration in the country. Now, one of the main reasons for doing that was that when we proceed with the individual sections of the Arbitration Act and come to the real nuances of how arbitration operates as a system on the ground level, the overarching background and framework would already have been clear to all of you. Now, with that in mind, over the next two sessions, today and on Sunday, we will go briefly through the various sections of the Arbitration Act. And in doing so, we will also explore the broad underlying themes that are sought to be addressed by these different sections. So, for today, we will essentially be looking at the practical aspects of not only the constitution of the tribunal, but also going before that, all the way up to the arbitration agreement, the invocation of the arbitration in the first place, the process or procedure which is followed by a tribunal while adjudicating the disputes, uh, the culmination of that process in the form of an award, aspects of bias, etc., independence, neutrality of arbitrators. So essentially, we'll be going through the entire gamut, but we will obviously in the next session have will leave some of the stuff out for the next session, which and where we will be talking about the aspects of challenge to an award, appellate proceedings, execution of awards, etc., etc., and we will also briefly deal with the differential sort of regime which exists in as far as foreign awards are concerned and which is represented through part 2 of the arbitration act. Now, when we deal with part 2 of the arbitration act, we will then deal with what constitutes an international commercial arbitration, what are the different parameters for an international commercial arbitration, what is the challenge procedure, if at all, etc., etc. And we will also deal with the different kinds of laws which may actually be applicable to an international commercial arbitration, because effectively in an international commercial arbitration, you have actually four different kinds of laws that may apply to the arbitration proceeding in question. So that is something which everybody who deals with international commercial arbitration must bear in mind. And in fact, there is a very recent judgment of the Supreme Court in Vedanta, where there is in fact a discussion on these different kinds of law which might be applicable in the very same proceeding. Now, that of course we will look at on Sunday. Now, as far as today's session is concerned, I hope all of you had gone through the Arbitration Act as I had requested. But what I will also be doing is primarily I will be undertaking today's session from the perspective of a section-wise analysis of the Arbitration Act and the different themes that are at play when we actually undertake that particular exercise. So, without any further ado, let's start with the Arbitration Act and the different aspects which we will be dealing with today. So, see, at the very outset, when you talk about an arbitration proceeding, as I mentioned to all of you in the last session, an arbitration tribunal or an arbitration tribunal comprising of a sole arbitrator or a larger number of arbitrators is something which is required to be constituted based on an agreement between the parties. Now, what this essentially reflects is, or what this represents in the common parlance is that this consent whereby both parties agree to actually refer their disputes to arbitration is something which must actually be contained in a specific written agreement between them. And therefore, it becomes very, very important for us to consider as to what exactly constitutes an arbitration agreement. Because as I mentioned to you, unlike in the case of the traditional courts or forums, you do not have any inherent right, either in terms of subject matter, territorial, or pecuniary jurisdiction, to approach an arbitral tribunal. Arbitration can only be invoked by you if there is an arbitration agreement between the parties. Now, one caveat here, there is a certain limited, let's say, exception to this in the sense of certain statutory arbitrations that we will deal with in the next session. Certain exceptions in the sense of arbitrations which, because of the subject matter of the dispute, will essentially then send the parties to arbitration without there being an express arbitration agreement between them. These are very limited exceptions, and it only applies to certain sector specific transactions or disputes, and which we will deal with on the next date. But please remember, the general ground rule is arbitration can only be invoked if there is an arbitration agreement. Now, in line with what we discussed on the last date also, this arbitration agreement is essentially nothing but an agreement to submit to arbitration all or certain disputes which may have arisen between the parties. Now, what exactly does an arbitration clause contain, or what are its prerequisites? Well, one, it may either be a clause contained within an agreement. This is the most common articulation or expression of an arbitration agreement. Or it may also take the form of a completely distinct agreement, dehors the main agreement, disputes arising under which this supplementary arbitration agreement, if I may call it that, will then mandate the parties to send their disputes for arbitration. Now, one very important aspect is an arbitration agreement is necessarily to be in writing. Arbitration agreements cannot be oral. You can't seek to try and prove an oral agreement. It must necessarily be in writing. But while this is so, this expression of what it means to be for an arbitration agreement to be in writing is relatively wide. The most straightforward way of looking at it is a document signed between the parties. So A and B, if they have a concluded contract, in that contract they may have an arbitration clause. So that is the simplest way in which you can articulate an arbitration agreement. Both parties sign on a document which contains an arbitration clause. Now, a slightly more convoluted way of examining or determining the existence of an arbitration clause is through exchange of communication. Now, as you know, under the Contract Act also, any sort of an exchange where there is an offer, there is an acceptance, or there is a proposal, there is a counter offer, then finally there is an acceptance, can lead to the determination that there is a concluded agreement between the parties. In much the same way, an arbitration agreement can also be deciphered from the communication between the parties. For instance, A and B want to enter into a transaction. A writes to B saying that, look, this is my offer. I will supply materials to you at this rate. And along with that offer, there is an arbitration clause. Now, B responds saying, all right, very good. I accept this offer and you can proceed to supply the goods to me. And obviously, in that acceptance, there is also an acceptance of the arbitration clause, which was contained in the offer. Then, for the purposes of Section 7, an arbitration agreement will be deemed to have come into existence between the parties, even if there is no standalone specific contract or agreement wherein both of them have put their signatures or expressed their consent specifically to refer the matters to arbitration. Now, this can also obviously arise in the case of exchange of pleadings, in which one party claims that there is an arbitration agreement between them and the other party does not really dispute this proposition. Then also by this, there can also be an arbitration agreement between the parties. Now, please remember, arbitration agreements typically are entered into when the original transaction between the parties is actually fructifies. So they are typically entered into before disputes arise, right? Because when you enter into a contract, obviously no party is actually anticipating a dispute or wanting a dispute. It's only when things go south subsequently that the arbitration is actually invoked. But there is no bar on parties agreeing to an arbitration even after disputes arise. So let's say you have an agreement which does not contain an arbitration clause. Absolutely no problem. In a rare event, both parties may agree that instead of going to a civil court or some other court after the disputes have arisen, that we want to go ahead and refer the disputes to arbitration. There is absolutely no problem. You can do that at any stage whatsoever and refer the matters to arbitration, provided the dispute itself is arbitrable. Now, that is something that we will come to subsequently. But as such, there is no bar in theory or in practice in terms of referring the disputes to arbitration after disputes have arisen, even in the absence of an arbitration agreement or clause in the original understanding between the parties. Now, this is as far as the arbitration agreement and what it constitutes is concerned. Now, please remember, under Section 8 of the Arbitration Act, there is the power to refer parties to arbitration where there is an arbitration agreement. Now, this is nothing but, let's say, an elaboration of what we discussed in the last class, in the sense that you must be conscious of the fact that once arbitration is entered into, the arbitration agreement is entered into, then your avenues to be able to take recourse to alternative methods of articulating your grievances, say by filing a civil suit, say by filing some other remedy which is otherwise available to you under the general law, to a large extent becomes proscribed. So this is to be read in line with section 5, which again we had spoken of in the last class, which read together will essentially completely, let's say, obliterate your ability to be able to take recourse to a civil suit. Now, please bear in mind there are certain limited exceptions. As I said, a writ petition theoretically is not barred. Similarly, over the years, for certain social welfare legislations, the court has drawn out let's say, a small exceptions. For instance, there is this judgment of the Supreme Court where this issue as to whether once a consumer forum is approached by, say, a consumer, but that consumer has an arbitration clause between him and the other entity, the counterparty, would Section 8 have any application? So the Supreme Court took the view that once the consumer forum is approached, considering it's a social welfare legislation and it is intended to protect consumers from, say, unequal bargaining practices, therefore, in that limited context, Section 8 may not have any application. So there are, of course, certain exceptions. But ultimately, please remember, mostly or at least across the board, subject to certain very limited exceptions, Section 8 read with Section 5 of the Arbitration Act will largely tie you down to an arbitration clause once you have agreed upon the same at any stage, whether it is before the disputes arise or after the disputes arise. Now, see, as we mentioned when we talked about how a civil suit progresses, one of the aspects which we had talked about was the aspect of interim applications. Now, in a civil suit, as I had mentioned, along with the civil suit, you obviously had the right to file an application for certain interim relief. Because as I gave you the example of the specifics of performance suit, there is a possibility that by the time the litigation in question is actually decided in your favor, in the absence of an interim relief, the other party might be at liberty to do whatever is required to actually circumvent, let's say, your ability to be able to actually go ahead and let's say be able to get any fruits of the decree at the final stage, right? So therefore, one aspect which is very, very common in civil suits is the ability to be able to actually get interim orders at a early stage in the proceedings which protect your interest going forward. Now, one important aspect is that ultimately, as far as arbitration aims to be a complete alternative or a perfect alternative to the entirety of a civil adjudication, naturally there must be a provision whereby arbitral tribunals are also able to actually go ahead and ensure that the necessary party before them is able to actually secure interim relief so as to ensure that the ultimate relief is not frustrated. So a provision which is very similar to Order 39 Rule 1 and 2 of the CPC, which is nothing but the provision for interim relief, is actually being put in place under the Arbitration Act also. So under Section 9 of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, the arbitral tribunal has significant power to be able to grant interim reliefs to the effect of preserving the subject matter of the dispute, other orders of protection, injunctions, etc., etc. Now, the general precedent or case law around this provision equates it to essentially equates it to the ability to be able to actually if you use the term, equates it to the effect that the parameters which govern Order 39 Rule 1 and 2 would also substantively govern this provision as well. So therefore, ultimately, if you want to go deeper into this exercise, you will find that the parameters under Order 39 Rule 1 and 2, which I had elaborated for you, in the sense that there must be a balance of convenience, there must be a very strong prima facie case, and the element of irreparable injury. These three elements will once again will actually come into play even when you talk about a Section 9 petition to be filed before the court. Right. So now, therefore, always remember or always bear in mind that ultimately the same parameters will apply when you are seeking interim relief, though of course the wording of Section 9 as compared to Order 39 Rule 1 and 2 might be a little different. Now, there are obviously certain exceptions or certain differences in the sense that even though there is a limited power which is recognized of arbitral tribunals to be able to order, uh, let's say, let's say orders against third parties, etc. But a court under Section 9, even though strictly speaking it is only concerned with the parties to the arbitration agreement, the court expressly has the power under Section 9 to be able to make orders against third parties also, provided the right involved is actually flowing from the arbitration agreement. To give you an example, the general principle under the Arbitration Act is that you cannot actually seek to impede or seek to get relief against non parties to an arbitration. But in the case of a Section 9 injunction, just imagine if the property in question is actually in the possession of a third party. Let's to give you an example, A and B have a contract, and a bank guarantee, let's say, is given by a third entity, and that third entity is only holding that bank guarantee or certain sum which it actually owes to B. So A is worried that if B actually takes that amount from C and utilizes it, it will not be left with any avenue to actually get an order in the future. So therefore, in such a case, C can be injuncted by the court under Section 9 to say, deposit that money with me, because today A has made out a prima facie case for certain entitlement against B, and therefore B should not be allowed to appropriate this amount from C, which otherwise belongs to B, but it remains with C during the pendency of the proceedings, and therefore the amount may be directed to be deposited with the court. So this is just to give you an understanding of the fact that even though strictly speaking, third parties cannot really be made parties to an arbitration for the purpose of interim relief, as long as the substantive right is flowing interstate the signatory parties, reliefs can be sought against third parties as well. It is a lot to be said in terms of the scope under 9, etc. Obviously, we don't have the time to deal with it in detail, but essentially it is a mirror image of the interim injunction or the interim relief provisions under the CPC. Now, this is as far as those preliminary or miscellaneous provisions are concerned. Now, moving forward and dealing with the arbitral tribunal itself. So, as I said, the arbitration agreement is what births the tribunal. Now, it is important for you to know how to be able to draft a good arbitration clause. Now, if you look online, you will find multiple webinars as also articles which will talk about what are the components which you must bear, or what are the essential elements you must bear in mind when you draft an effective arbitration clause. Now, again, that is a very detailed topic. I've spoken about it in the past. But again, it is impossible to condense into, say, 10 or 15 minutes because it's just too vast. So I would recommend that, especially as practitioners, please do go through a few of those articles or a few of those webinars to just see what are the elements you must bear in mind when you draft an arbitration agreement. This is extremely important in the context of arbitration, in the context of the customizability. So therefore, your arbitration agreement is what customizes your arbitration experience to a large extent. And therefore, it is very, very important to be very clear about what are the different parameters which are at play and what are the ones which you want to pick and choose in terms of your client's interests going forward and when you draft the arbitration agreement. So please bear in mind, please do look this material up online. And if any of you can't find something relevant, just let me know. I will send across a couple of important links. Now, having said that, when we move forward to how exactly the arbitrate tribunal essentially is constituted, firstly, please bear in mind that under the Arbitration Act 1996, and this is a significant departure from the 1940 Act, you cannot have an even number of arbitrators. So effectively, your choice must either be, effectively speaking, a sole arbitrator or a 3-member arbitral tribunal. Now, theoretically, you can have a 5-member tribunal, 7-member tribunal, you can go up to 21, 27, any odd number is possible. But for all practical purposes, arbitral tribunals are either comprised of a sole arbitrator or of a 3-member tribunal. Though in some cases where there is a multi-party agreement, etc., I have seen it only in one occasion so far, a 5-member tribunal. So that is quite rare. So please bear in mind, even number arbitral tribunal is simply not feasible. The Act only permits you to have an odd number of arbitrators. Now, whether this is a mandatory provision, whether the award is liable to be set aside, etc., these have been the subject matter of some controversy. There is a Supreme Court judgment which says that if the tribunal anyway consists of 2 members and there is no objection to that, then finally at the 34th stage, it will be too inequitable to permit the award to be set aside just because you have an even number of arbitrators. But whenever you approach a court to actually operate or operationalize your arbitration agreement, please bear in mind that if there is an even number of arbitrators, the court is simply not going to agree. And there is case law which says that an arbitration clause providing for two arbitrators is to be read as providing for a sole arbitrator, and the court must make an appointment accordingly. So anyway, that is the specifics of the issue. Section 11, very, very important. Section 11 is essentially the recourse available to any party which is facing a gridlock in as much as the counterparty refuses to honor its bargain in terms of constituting the arbitral tribunal. Now, please bear in mind that under the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, if you read Section 11, I'm not going through it specifically, I'm just giving you a capsule form of what exactly it contemplates. Under the arbitration agreement, there can be two eventualities. One is that the parties agree as to the procedure for constitution of the tribunal. So let's say A and B have an arbitration clause. They may provide for a 3-member arbitral tribunal, and they may say that A will appoint one arbitrator, B will appoint the other arbitrator, and the presiding or third arbitrator will be chosen mutually by the two so appointed arbitrators. Right? There can be other eventuality where the parties say that we will have a sole arbitrator and some arbitration institution will appoint that arbitrator, say Indian Council of Arbitration or the Delhi International Arbitration Center or whatever. A third scenario is if the parties will not lay down any procedure but simply say, if the disputes arise between us, we will proceed for arbitration in terms of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act. So therefore, you are now left with a situation where either there is an agreed procedure or there is no agreed procedure. So if there is an agreed procedure, and if one of the counterparties fails to act as per that procedure, let's say in the case of A versus B, A invokes arbitration, appoints its nominee, calls upon B to appoint its arbitrator, but B does not do so, then within 30 days of the failure to do so, pursuant to having received your request for arbitration, you are entitled to go to the court and ask for appointment of an arbitrator in terms of the agreement. Now, the case law says that if the other party fails to act as required, then it will forfeit its right under the agreement to appoint the arbitrator, and the court will then appoint an arbitrator for it without its concurrence. Similarly, in the case of an arbitral institution, if the arbitral institution fails to act as required under the agreement in terms of appointing the arbitrator, then within 30 days of that default, you are then entitled to go before the court and seek appointment. Now, this is in the case where there is a procedure. If there is no procedure at all, then it is very straightforward. You may request the other side to come forward and consent to the constitution of a tribunal. If that consent is not responded to favorably within 30 days, even otherwise, you have a right to go to the court and ask for appointment of an arbitral tribunal. So Section 11 is essentially the recourse provision, whereby if your arbitration agreement is not being operationalized because of the reluctance of the counterparty, you are entitled to go to the court and seek appointment of an arbitrator. Now, please bear in mind two important aspects. In the case of an international commercial arbitration, a Section 11 petition will only lie before the Supreme Court. For all matters aside from an international commercial arbitration, that is domestic arbitrations, the Section 11 petitions will only lie before the High Court. This is a small differential because even before High Courts which don't have original jurisdiction, a Section 11 will only lie before a High Court. A Section 11 cannot be filed before a district court. So even in a High Court which doesn't have original jurisdiction, even if the dispute is only 50,000, or in a High Court which actually has original jurisdiction for matters above 2 crores, but the dispute is only 50,000, Section 11 by its very nature is only filed before a High Court. Please bear this in mind because there's a lot of confusion about this. So therefore, just to revise, Section 11s insofar as international commercial arbitrations are concerned are filed directly before the Supreme Court. In the case of High Courts, they are filed, in the case of domestic or non-international commercial arbitrations, they are filed before the concerned High Courts within whose jurisdiction the cause of action would have arisen, or in terms of where the agreement actually bestows jurisdiction upon the court concerned. Now, related to this is the aspect of seat and venue, which we will come to later when we look at some of the different provisions, one of the most controversial areas of discussion in arbitration in the recent times. So section 11, there are a lot of permutations and combinations, when your right applies, when it accrues, etc. Again, that is too detailed a aspect to be gone into, considering we only have 2 or 3 classes to give an overview of the arbitration agreement. And also, please bear in mind that now the scope of adjudication under this section 11 has been significantly whittled down. Now, earlier there was to be a lot of controversy because, under section 11, many a times the proceedings used to get very, very contested, and parties would fight, hook, line, and sinker on the merits of the controversy, and courts would spend months or years adjudicating on a section 11, and which completely defeats the whole point of arbitration, because if a party is able to say stall arbitration for 3 or 4 years at the very initial step of appointment, then really the entire efficacy of the process goes for a toss. So under the amendment in 2015, a subsection 11(6)(a) was incorporated, which essentially now limits the scope of examination only to the existence of an arbitration agreement. So for a court to appoint an arbitrator, now you can no longer argue before a court that, oh, the claims are barred by limitation. Earlier, you could take this argument in 11 to try and defeat the reference. Now you can no longer argue that, oh, there is accord and satisfaction between the parties. Earlier, you could have done so. So now 11(6)(a) has significantly whittled down the, let's say, the impact or the ability of parties to be able to rake up all sorts of issues at the initial stage of appointment of an arbitrator. And now the court is only supposed to take a look at the provisions which actually pertain to the existence of the arbitration agreement itself, because that is obviously fundamental. Now, please bear in mind, under the 2019 amendment, effectively 11(6)(a) itself is sought to be taken away, and the entire, let's say, power to appoint arbitrators is sought to be delegated to arbitral institutions. And the Supreme Court and High Court, therefore, in the future, as is contemplated, would no longer be entertaining Section 11 applications. But frankly, that provision under the 2019 amendment is yet to be notified. So that is not the law so far. And also, that process itself is going to be extremely problematic. A lot of people have written about how the ecosystem in the country today, as it exists, doesn't really permit for this sort of a blanket sort of a delegation of this crucial power to arbitral institutions. Though there are some very good ones, but pan-India, the number of institutions which exist of this stature is not really of a very high number. So anyway, that's a different matter of discussion entirely. Now, sections 12, 13, and 14. See, 12, 13, and 14 effectively deal with the aspect of independence and impartiality of arbitrators. Now, see, as I mentioned to you at the outset, one slightly jarring note which anyone who for the first time looks at arbitration might encounter is that ultimately you are going before a forum which is a private creation, and you are going before a forum that has the ability or has the power to actually determine your rights and liabilities in a legally enforceable fashion. So if that is the case, naturally it is very, very important that the particular individual or the 3-member arbitral tribunal is completely above board insofar as independence and impartiality is concerned. Now, to ensure that this independence and impartiality actually exist, under sections 12 and 13 of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, read with schedules 5 and 7, there are certain objective parameters, as objective as possible, which have been put in place by the legislature to determine the extent of independence or impartiality. Now, this is a marked departure from the 1996 Act, which didn't have any such objective criteria, but left it more on a case-to-case analysis to determine if at all a arbitrator was biased or not. Now, therefore, please go through the 5th and 7th schedule. The only difference between them is there are a lot of overlapping entries also. The 5th schedule only lays down parameters which will help you or not help you, which might lead to certain justifiable doubts as to independence or impartiality. So the fifth schedule, in that sense, is not mandatory, in the sense that there are judgments which say that if there are grounds under the fifth schedule, the arbitrator must definitely disclose them. Now, under 12, 13, and 14, the arbitrator has a mandate that when he or she enters upon the reference, they must make a disclosure in terms of the schedule given under the Arbitration Act, disclosing if there are any reasons which will give or result in any doubt as to their independence and impartiality. But please bear in mind that when this disclosure is given, there are two kinds of criteria. The criteria under the fifth schedule can be explained away by the arbitrator. To give you an example, under the fifth schedule, one of the grounds is that if an arbitrator has accepted an appointment as an arbitrator from one of the parties to the dispute on more than two occasions in the past 3 years, when he is approached to be an arbitrator again, this might give rise to justifiable doubts, right? But this is something which is not a killing blow. An arbitrator may explain saying, I'm a very I'm having 40 arbitrations or 25 arbitrations going on simultaneously. So ultimately, I may have been appointed 3 times in the past 2 years, but considering my overall workload, this is not a big sum or not a large amount of arbitrations. And therefore, I don't think I have any bias or any sort of a lack of independence just because I have been appointed more than 2 times by a party. Now, if this is 20 times, 25 times in the last 3 years, obviously any party will be, apprehensive. So that's a different matter altogether. But a fifth schedule at least can be a matter of argument. An arbitrator, after making a correct disclosure, may always say that I don't believe this has in any way impacted my independence or impartiality. But an arbitrator who falls afoul of the seventh schedule, it is instant death. There is absolutely no way that arbitrator can continue. And in fact, judgments of the Supreme Court indicate that if you fall within the seventh schedule, then your appointment itself is de facto invalid. It was never valid in the first place. So therefore, this is the essential difference between the fifth schedule and the seventh schedule when we talk about determining independence and impartiality of arbitrators. Now, without going into the specifics, these provisions have also been considered by the courts, and in fact, a lot of the judgments now have actually gone far beyond these provisions in terms of trying to ensure that thematically there is no bias in the arbitration proceedings. Now, one of the best examples is the judgment of the Supreme Court in, for instance, TRF Limited or Perkins. Now, the recent judgment in Perkins is something all of you must be aware of. The Perkins judgment, in fact, the Supreme Court struck down the possibility of a party to a contract effectively being able to appoint a sole arbitrator unilaterally, even if the agreement permitted this. So this is a huge change because the very underlying notion of arbitration is party autonomy, and these clauses are otherwise upheld across the world, permitting one of the parties to nominate an arbitrator who will be the sole arbitrator if the agreement in question actually bestows that power upon that party. But as I mentioned to you, in India, because of some abuses which we have seen in the past in terms of how these powers were actually utilized by parties, increasingly we see that the party autonomy is giving way to a more structured or a more top-down approach, in the sense of which the statute actually dictates a large amount of the kind of power which you can exercise in the form of customizability of the arbitration. So even if you have an arbitration agreement today, which you draft for your client, which gives your client the power to appoint a sole arbitrator, as per the judgment in Perkins, you do not have the power to actually appoint that arbitrator should disputes arise, and your agreement to that extent will not be read or will effectively be ineffective. So there is so much precedent around 12, 13, 14, independence, impartiality. It's basically calls for a course on its own. But for all of you who are interested, this is a very, very, let's say, interesting subject matter, and one which will witness adjudication for decades to come, because each and every entry in the fifth schedule or the seventh schedule will ultimately at some point of time, someday, actually be a matter which, essentially becomes a matter of debate in the form of controversy in relation to one case or the other. Now, in fact, beyond the elements of bias under 14, an arbitrator's mandate shall also terminate if he or she becomes de jure or de facto unable to perform functions. For instance, death. For instance, an arbitrator is very critically unwell and he or she is then say in an ICU for 8 months, 9 months, 12 months, right? The arbitration completely goes for a toss. Then in these circumstances, obviously you can ask for termination of the mandate of an arbitrator. Now, when the mandate is terminated, obviously you go back to the original rules which governed your case, and the arbitrator, the substitute arbitrator, is appointed accordingly. But the exception to this is if in the original round, the agreement itself was not given effect to, in the sense that the counterparty did not appoint, you went to court, got it appointed, then the reference to the rules here will mean a reference to what transpired in the earlier round, in the sense that the court had to intervene. So there are judgments which clarify the rules do not mean that you will go back to status quo, and that a party which lost a right at the first stage will now be able to reappoint merely because the arbitrator resigned or could not proceed further with the case. So that again is something which there is a nuanced exposition on this in a lot of judgments. Now, section 16, very, very important. See, section 16 embodies the principle of competence. Competence is nothing but the acceptance of the fact that the arbitral tribunal is competent to rule on its own jurisdiction. So essentially what this means is that, see, there obviously in every case there will be a contestation on merits. But in many cases, there is a threshold objection as to jurisdiction. You may argue that a tribunal does not have jurisdiction because of A, B, C, D reasons. One, you may argue that, let's say you take an argument that there are accepted matters under an arbitration agreement. Now, if you go through any of the literature around how to draft an arbitration agreement, you will find that an arbitration agreement can be customized to only apply to certain disputes between the parties. To give you an example, in a construction contract, in many cases, you will find that parties or the public sectors actually put in a clause saying that we will agree to go for arbitration on any dispute, say, for instance, unpaid sums, damages, change in specifications, etc. But if there is a dispute as to the validity of the termination of the agreement, then that will be an accepted matter, not referable to arbitration. So accepted matters are recognized under the Arbitration Act, under the arbitration law of the country in terms of judgments, etc. And therefore, you are entitled to specify that only certain kinds of disputes will go for arbitration, whereas the other disputes will then be relegated to the normal civil remedy. So let's say somebody takes a ground that out of 10 claims, 4 claims cannot be adjudicated upon by the tribunal because they lack jurisdiction in as much as these are recognized as accepted matters under the arbitration agreement. Now, if section 16 was not there, who will decide jurisdiction? You will probably have to go to a civil court and demonstrate to the civil court that, look here, the arbitrator doesn't have jurisdiction, therefore stall or set aside his proceedings, don't let them continue qua these 4 claims. But again, that would obviously go against section 5 and section 8 and the mandate to eschew court intervention as much as possible. Therefore, this is a very important power given to the arbitral tribunal to rule on its own jurisdiction. So therefore, not only the question on merits, but also threshold or fundamental objections under jurisdiction are to be taken care of by the arbitral tribunal. Now, this therefore, this section is the one which actually makes it all encompassing the adjudicatory power of the arbitral tribunal. Because everything under the sun, including questions as to whether it has jurisdiction or not, are decided by an arbitral tribunal. Now, obviously, this decision is subject to review. So the Act contemplates that the arbitral tribunal says that it does not have jurisdiction. Immediately, you can file an appeal under Section 37. If the arbitral tribunal rules that it has jurisdiction, then you can't file any appeal. You will have to wait for the ultimate award and then challenge it by way of a Section 34 proceeding. Now, there is one judgment of the Supreme Court which says that in the Section 16 plea, in deciding the Section 16 plea, even if the tribunal rejects the plea, if it actually leads to a final decision on a matter which can never be reviewed in the future, and which actually affects the rights and liabilities of the parties in a very critical way, then at that stage itself, you may be able to construe this ruling as an award and try and challenge it under Section 34 immediately as an award or as an interim award. So that is one recent judgment of Justice Nariman, which has actually opened up one more mechanism to be able to try and assail this particular adjudication. But otherwise, please bear in mind, the general rule is if your Section 16 is rejected, i.e., if the tribunal comes to the conclusion that it has jurisdiction, then you will have to wait for the final award to be passed by the tribunal and then challenge this determination also as part of your challenge. However, if the tribunal rules and says that it does not have the jurisdiction, naturally, to that extent, the proceedings will terminate. Let's say, qua the four claims, or if all your claims are accepted, qua all your claims. So, therefore, in that case, you immediately have a right of appeal under Section 37 to the concerned civil court. Now, just as in the case of Section 9, under Section 17, once an arbitral tribunal is constituted, the arbitral tribunal can also be approached for interim measures. Now, largely after the amendment in 2015, the scope of powers under 17 and 9 are now very similar. Because earlier, under 17, the scope of powers was very, very narrow as compared to the scope of powers under Section 9. Now, however, they are largely similar. The tribunal also has almost coterminous powers as the Section 9 court has. And please bear in mind, once the tribunal is constituted, then Section 9 itself contemplates that the proceedings will then be transferred to the arbitral tribunal to be decided in terms of Section 17. Now, what this practically means is, let's say you have a dispute between you and the other party. Now, because the other party is refusing to constitute an arbitral tribunal, it may take you 3 months or 4 months or 5 months to constitute a tribunal. In the interregnum, what if the other party dissipates the assets? Therefore, you may rush to a court under Section 9 because the court is pre-existing and seek a interim order. But after that, subsequently, when the arbitral tribunal is constituted, then the Section 9 itself contemplates that once the tribunal is constituted, then the Section 9 petition should ideally be then transferred to the arbitral tribunal, because ultimately that is the tribunal which is more aware and which is actually sitting to decide that controversy, and therefore is the more appropriate forum to actually conduct those proceedings. Now, also, I'm sorry, I missed out one aspect. When it comes to bias and independence and impartiality of arbitrators, in terms of the challenge procedure, once you make that challenge before the arbitral tribunal, please bear in mind that if it is a challenge under Schedule 5, if the tribunal rejects the challenge, once again, your only option is to actually take up that challenge in the Section 34 stage at the end. If the arbitral tribunal allows the challenge, naturally there is no question, because the tribunal will then get disbanded, or that one single arbitrator in a 3-member tribunal will then resign. But if your challenge is under Schedule 7, which is complete ineligibility, you don't even have to move the arbitrator first. You can directly approach the court and ask for a removal if your matter comes under Schedule 7, or in the alternative, you may raise it before the arbitrator concerned. And if he rejects it, you can still go before the court and ask for an immediate removal, provided your matter falls under Schedule 7. If it's under Schedule 5, you cannot go immediately. You must wait for the final determination and challenge it in the arbitral award. Now, going back to what we spoke about, this is as far as those provisions in terms of constitution of the tribunal, independence, impartiality are concerned. But what about conduct of arbitration proceedings? See, arbitration proceedings are largely similar to the, let's say, the elaboration which we went through in terms of how a civil litigation trial proceeds. And I say this similarity is on the fundamentals, not so much in terms of the actual expressed procedure. See, a tribunal also is required to treat parties in the same manner in which a sovereign court would have, in the sense that you must treat them with equality, as is natural justice, complete equality in terms of treatment, etc. And you must provide them with full opportunity to present their respective cases. Now, while doing so, the tribunal is not bound by the CPC or the Indian Evidence Act. So therefore, strictly speaking, the rigors, because as we saw under the CPC, there is very rigorous provisions in terms of timelines, ways of doing things, etc. This does not apply to arbitration tribunals, but please be aware that the judicial interpretation of these sections has held that even though the rigor is inapplicable, the fundamental principles as contained under the CPC or the Evidence Act in terms of the guiding principles will still be applicable to arbitration proceedings. One example is, say, the res judicata principle. Now, there are judgments which say that res judicata, even though it is something which is seen to be born out of, say, the CPC, etc., is something which will still be applicable to arbitration proceedings. Similarly, order to rule 2. the bar on filing a action which should actually have been claimed at the outset, even though it is actually expressed in the CPC. There are judgments which say that is so fundamental to the entire concept of adversarial litigation as recognized in India that that will still be applicable to arbitration proceedings. So again, going back to what I said in the last session, therefore, it is not as if arbitration is completely divorced from litigation in that sense. Because ultimately, the fundamental guiding principles of the basic statutes under the litigation firmament will still, to a large extent, impregnate and inform the process of arbitration under the Arbitration and Conciliation Act. Now, where are arbitration proceedings conducted? So arbitration proceedings, again, is a matter where you can customize and determine where the arbitration will be conducted. So two parties, let's say in the case of a court, what I had mentioned to you was that in the case of a sovereign court, parties cannot bestow jurisdiction on a court which otherwise does not have it. So if the entire cause of action, say, arose between Delhi and Bombay, parties can't agree that, oh, we will go and litigate, say, in a court in Jammu and Kashmir or a court in Goa. But in arbitration, you can always determine the place or seat of arbitration to be any place which you feel is most convenient for you in terms of the the mutual convenience. Now, this has in fact taken on a whole new life post the judgment of the Supreme Court in Balco, which is a constitution bench judgment, wherein the Supreme Court then actually, let's say, incorporated the concept of seat under international commercial arbitration into the domestic context also. So therefore, the seat of arbitration, which is obviously a little more than the place of arbitration in terms of the legal significance, will now determine a lot of aspects. And in fact, the seat of arbitration is now construed to be the equivalent of an exclusive jurisdiction clause. What it means is, let's say you determine the seat to be Goa. Then even though all the cause of action arose either in Delhi or Bombay, only the courts in Goa will then have jurisdiction to actually intervene or carry out any of the functions which are given to them under the Arbitration and Conciliation Act. Now, let's say, to give another example, Delhi and Bombay only have jurisdiction, but you decide to seat the arbitration in Jammu and Kashmir. Then, if you want to approach a court under Section 11, say the High Court, to appoint the arbitral tribunal, constitute the arbitral tribunal, if the seat is Jammu and Kashmir, then only the Jammu and Kashmir High Court will have jurisdiction. It is a little surprising when you look at the general principles under the CPC, which say nothing doing. It is cause of action which will determine which court you go to. So effectively, under the arbitration law, seat of arbitration, please remember, venue, place, and seat can be interpreted differently. They don't necessarily mean the same thing. So the most legally profound term in that sense is seat of arbitration. So under the arbitration proceedings or arbitration ecosystem, seat of arbitration is actually construed to be the equivalent of a cause of action in itself, thereby rendering not only jurisdiction to a court, but in terms of the recent judgments of the Supreme Court, including Indus Mobile, actually amounting to an exclusive jurisdiction clause. Now, interestingly, judgments have gone to the extent of saying that if there is a separate exclusive jurisdiction clause in an agreement, even then the seat provision will override that, and the seat alone will determine which court has exclusive jurisdiction. So yeah, so there is a lot of controversy as to whether this is the correct approach, but that's the law as it stands today. Now, also please bear in mind that unlike the case of the Evidence Act of the CPC, Limitation Act is expressly made applicable to arbitration proceedings, because limitation essentially, as I mentioned to you, is something which is fundamental. Are you permitted to take up or undertake a course of action or not? So in the case of limitation, please bear in mind that it is very much applicable to arbitration proceedings, and that is why Section 21 is important. See, in the case of a normal proceeding which goes before a court or tribunal, limitation will be, let's say, ascertained from when you file that particular pleading or file your case before that court or tribunal. See, but in the case of arbitration, there is no such tribunal pre-existing between the parties. So therefore, for the purpose of the Arbitration Act, a dispute or a cause of action or an arbitration in relation to a dispute is deemed to have commenced on the day when you inform the other side that you are now interested in going for arbitration because the disputes which exist between the parties are unable to be resolved. So this is what we call the invocation provision. So under section 21, it is very, very important in two parameters. One, you cannot ask for appointment, say under section 11, without invoking. So if you go to a section 11 court, first you must show a communication wherein you formally invoked arbitration under section 21. That's why 21 is very, very important. Number two, 21 also determines your limitation. Because let's say you have a 3-year period, disputes have arisen. That 3-year period is going to be construed in the context of when you invoke arbitration and not when you first file your statement of claim before the tribunal. So the invocation date is what will be relevant to determine when your limitation actually freezes or the clock stops running. So please bear in mind, section 21 is extremely important because this is really the originating provision in terms of putting in place your arbitration proceedings. Now, again, in the matter of customizability, language is something which you can specifically agree upon. So you can have any language. English is usually what we always use, but there is no bar to you actually agreeing to having an arbitration in a regional language or even a foreign language, depending on what your requirements are. And that again is subject to some administrative nuances in terms of the tribunal requiring translation, etc., etc. That of course is a different matter altogether. Now, pleadings. See, much as I mentioned to you in the case of civil litigation also, if the matter proceeds on the merits before an arbitral tribunal, you will be required to put in place pleadings. So just like you would have had a plaint or a writ petition in the case of a normal civil litigation, either before a civil court or before a writ court, before an arbitral tribunal, you are similarly required to put in place a statement of claim. And if you are for the respondent, you are required to put in place a statement of defense along with your counterclaim, if any. Much like in the case of a rejoinder or a replication, this is not expressly provided for, but as a matter of course, many tribunals will permit you to put in place a rejoinder or a replication if there is some new points or new aspects which have been brought out by the respondent in his or her defense. Now, again, under 23(3), just like in the case of the CPC, there is a provision to amend your pleadings, provided you meet that benchmark, which in the case of the arbitration ecosystem is far more liberal in the sense that the only real problem is the element of delay. So the tribunal feels that the application for amendment is very belated, then obviously it can refuse that application for amendment. And in fact, there are some judgments which have then sought to interpolate some of the requirements under the CPC also, or the case law emanating under the CPC also, that if there is an express admission made by a party, etc., that cannot be sought to be whittled away by an amendment. So that again is a matter of nuance, is a matter of examining the relevant case law. Now, hearings and written proceedings, very, very important. See, just like primacy is given to oral hearings under our general adversarial system of litigation, similarly, unless the parties agree otherwise, see, parties can agree to this saying, we don't want an oral hearing, please just decide based on the pleadings. But unless the parties so agree, the arbitral tribunal is required to hold oral hearings at an appropriate stage of the proceedings unless the parties have agreed otherwise. So the tribunal has full power in terms of deciding how are the pleadings to be filed, what is the timeline, how will the evidence be led, etc., etc. All of that is upon the tribunal to decide. But oral hearings are held to be non-derogable unless both parties agree otherwise. Now, also bear in mind that oral evidence also, ultimately the tribunal is to decide whether, if at all, oral evidence is required in a matter. But as a matter of general practice, when parties require oral evidence to be led, tribunals usually permit, because if you completely shut out oral evidence, tomorrow a party may come and say that it has not been given an opportunity to actually put forth its case in the right manner. And that can lead to complications at a later stage. And therefore, tribunals usually will try and avoid that and will give that necessary leeway for parties to lead oral evidence before the tribunal. Though, of course, the amount of oral evidence, the time taken, etc., is something which the tribunal obviously will try and oversee and curate. Now, again, there is a default provision, just like under the CPC, if a party fails or refuses to turn up, naturally the tribunal cannot be held hostage to the non-appearance of a party concerned. So therefore, if a party does not turn up, in the sense a claimant fails to file a statement of claim despite repeated opportunities, the respondent fails to file a statement of defense despite repeated opportunities, or there is a general failure to appear at any subsequent stage, the arbitral tribunal may actually strike off the defense or otherwise proceed ex parte against the defaulting party. And therefore, just like in the case of a civil court or a general civil litigation forum, you cannot hold a tribunal to ransom through non-appearance, and there will be consequences if you decide or even otherwise are negligent in terms of prosecuting the case before the tribunal. Now, again, as I mentioned to you, just like in the case of civil courts, tribunals are empowered to take outside assistance, especially in the case of if there are, let's say, very complex technical issues which arise before tribunals. Now, these experts are distinct from the experts which you may produce before the tribunal as your witnesses. As we talked about when we elaborated upon the element of how oral evidence is led, you may as a party want to lead an expert of your own as a witness. But distinct from that, an arbitral tribunal in a particular case may appoint an expert of its own to actually assist it in determining certain areas of controversy. Now, to give you an example, let's say a tribunal is faced with a very difficult accounting controversy in, say, relation to profit loss, expenditure incurred, etc., etc. A tribunal may decide to appoint a chartered accountant and take a report from that CA in terms of what the CA's opinion is. Of course, his opinion is then required to be given to the parties so that the parties may then make their submissions on the merits or the demerits of that report, so that once again the element of natural justice, etc., etc., is complied with. But subject to those natural justice requirements being complied with, a tribunal is fully empowered to appoint an expert to assist it in arriving at a correct conclusion. And this is something which is not explicitly so available, let's say, to a civil court, in the normal parlance. Now, also, please bear in mind that there are some limitations which an arbitral tribunal may obviously encounter in the sense of the lack of sovereign power. Now, for instance, before a court, if you want to have a certain person being examined as a witness, but that person is not under your control. Let's say you want to summon, let's say, an official from a government department. If you are fighting about the ownership of a property, you might want to summon someone from the registrar's office to show to the court what does the register evidencing registration of that property actually say in terms of ownership. Now, an arbitral tribunal doesn't have sovereign power. So let's say A and B have a dispute. If an arbitral tribunal tries to summon an official from the registrar's office, from the sub-registrar's office, say, for instance, they will say, what the heck is this forum? I don't accept this forum's power or jurisdiction. It's a private forum. Why should I, as a government officer or as a government servant, actually go and give evidence before a private forum? So this obviously is an issue. Therefore, to obviate this, if the parties actually require the presence of a particular witness in order to be actually able to, let's say, prove their case, then they are required to make a request in this regard to the arbitral tribunal. And when the arbitral tribunal finds that that particular document or witness, whatever production is being sought of, is not in the power of either party, then the tribunal can then actually request the court or grant permission to the party to make an application with permission of the tribunal to the court to direct that witness to be present before the tribunal on a particular date to give evidence. So these are the ways in which the Arbitration Act ensures that the lacuna which may be faced by a tribunal on account of the lack of that all-encompassing sovereign power can then be remedied by the assistance of the court, wherein the court will then exercise its sovereign power to come to the assistance of the arbitral tribunal to be able to actually conduct the proceedings and then go forward with the matter. So these are all the different mechanisms by way of which the proceedings before the tribunal are mirrored as much as possible to that of a civil court in terms of the power and the efficacy of the process. But as you saw here, a lot of the elements such as the rigors of the CPC or the Evidence Act, the fact that the parties can actually customize and agree on a variety of things, the fact that the tribunal has the discretion if the parties can't agree to modulate its own procedure. So essentially, arbitration tries to provide that range of flexibility while at the same time ensuring that the process itself is efficacious and does not suffer from the limitations which normally a private adjudicatory forum would suffer from, as opposed to the all encompassing power or scope of a sovereign or a traditional court adjudicatory system. So these are the ways and means in which the Act tries to balance out all of these elements, as I mentioned to you, including elements of independence, impartiality, approaching a court if the counterparty refuses to participate in the arbitration proceedings in the sense of the constitution of the tribunal, etc., etc. So I had actually planned to go ahead with a few more sections, but since it's already 7:30, I think we will stop here. And on Sunday, we will start with section 28, though I intended to cover 5, 6 sections more, but there is obviously, I don't want to stretch it too far today. So therefore, please, my suggestion will be, please once again read through these sections which we read through already, and so that if there are any such doubts as such on the next date of in the next class on Sunday, you can ask me those also. And in the next class, we will actually start with section 28. Now, if there are any questions, please let me know in terms of your doubts, in terms of whatever we have discussed today. I will just stop sharing and then I will come back to the main interface. Yeah, right. So 2 questions. Yeah, first from Umang. Does the Act regulate party appointed experts? Yeah, actually. So see, unfortunately or whatever, fortunately, depending on your perception or depending on your perspective, just give me one moment. Yeah, sorry. So depending on your perception, fortunately or unfortunately, the Act does not really provide for any such parameter. See, under the Act, there is a provision which we will come to, which says that the arbitral tribunal is competent to determine both the materiality as also the relevance of the evidence. Ultimately, a party appointed expert is nothing but an element of evidence. Obviously, the party who is bringing an expert tries to portray the fact that I am bringing somebody who is not connected to me, who is actually an expert. But this is again a matter of evidence. So when we dealt with cross-examination, if you remember, there was a separate slide in terms of how to cross-examine an expert witness. And some of the pointers there were that try and break that let's say that veneer or that sort of exposition which the witness tries to portray before the tribunal, that I am a neutral person. So unfortunately or fortunately, under the Act, there is absolutely no such guideline in terms of objective parameters to determine neutrality or independence of expert witnesses. And that is something which is something for you to demonstrate before the tribunal by asking the correct questions. In terms of ethical guidelines, yes, obviously you will find certain best practices internationally wherein experts obviously are required to follow certain basic guidelines. For instance, they are ideally they are not supposed to enter into any sort of an agreement with the party where there is an express sort of an undertaking by them that come what may, they will provide a favorable report for the party concerned. So, but again, see, these are matters which are not really very implementable in the sense that you may not write that on paper. So nobody will be stupid enough to write on a piece of paper that you pay me this much money, 100% I will give you a positive report. So nowadays, parties are smart enough, most parties are smart enough to actually have neutral sounding agreements with their party experts, wherein the agreement will only say that this is the amount to be paid to you, and you will then give us a report in terms of what is the what is the actual position in relation to the controversy. But then, frankly speaking, obviously experts also do want, right, to generate work, to generate business. So unfortunately, in a lot of cases, you will see that experts actually transcend into basically being guns for hire. And therefore, again, but like this is not something which it's very easy to pin down in the sense of a universal guideline. This is again something you need to demonstrate by actually impugning the credibility of that expert witness when the arguments happen, after you base those arguments on what you've managed to bring out of the witness in your cross examination. So I hope that answers your question, Umang. Priyanka's question is, suppose a tribunal refuses to admit crucial evidence wherein essential. Right. Now, see, again, the issue is that the stage at which this refusal to admit evidence happens, obviously, is at an interim stage. Now, there is no such provision under the Arbitration Act. When we come to Section 37, the appellate proceedings, there is no real recourse available to you to actually try and challenge such a decision taken by the tribunal at that interim stage. Unless you are, let's say, practicing in a high court where under Article 227 interference is, let's say, very, very common, and which is not the case across most of the country, your only recourse effectively is to make this a ground of challenge ultimately when you challenge the award. Because this will be something which you will try and bring under patent illegality or violation of the principles of natural justice. That something essential to be able to determine your case in the correct perspective, and evidence which was legally permissible for you to lead and which has a crucial bearing on the case was incorrectly declined by the arbitral tribunal. So depending on the severity and depending on the impact which this has on the ultimate result, you may be able to actually make out a case eventually when you challenge the award under Section 34 and possibly have the award set aside on this ground. So as far as recourse is concerned, yes, you have a recourse, but it is a recourse which you may not have immediately, but may only be able to have at the fag end of the proceeding. So again, this is why, again, it's important to be very, very aware of what is the kind of tribunal before whom you are leading evidence or before whom you are undertaking the cross-examination, because these are matters which are very, very discretionary and you may not have an immediate recourse against any, let's say, direction or discretion which the tribunal may employ at that stage. Right. So interesting question from Prashasti. Is the consent supposed to be explicit, or does the general consent? No, it see effectively under the arbitration law, the arbitration agreement is recognized as one which is distinct from the mother agreement. Now, why is this so? Let's say the arbitration agreement is not recognized legally as being distinct from the mother agreement. Then let's say in a dispute between A and B, B terminates the agreement. When you try to invoke arbitration, B simple answer will be, boss, there is no arbitration agreement today because I terminated the agreement which contains the arbitration clause. So to overcome any such argument, the normative precept which has evolved is that the arbitration agreement has a distinct existence from the main agreement which the parties may enter into. So therefore, on that same principle, merely because A and B decide to enter into a contractual relationship in the form of communication will not be enough to postulate an arbitration agreement between them. So let's say, to give you an example, A writes to B saying, hi, will you be agreeable to sell this particular product X to me at a price of rupees 1 lakh? B responds to him saying, all right, yes, sir, I will sell this product X to you at 1 lakh rupees. There is a concluded formation, let's say, of an agreement. But unless in A's offer, A wrote, will you be agreeable to sell X to me at 1 lakh rupees? And if there is any dispute between us in the future, we can go to arbitration. And B responds saying, yes, I will sell this to you. And let's say either B says, I specifically agree to go for arbitration, or B generally says, I agree to whatever is your offer. Then impliedly, B can be said to have agreed to the arbitration agreement also. So even if there is no express agreement to arbitrate in the sense of the correspondence, as long as the arbitration agreement is specifically contained in the offer and B's acceptance does not in any way exclude that part of the offer, but has an all-encompassing acceptance of the offer, then obviously you can say that the arbitration agreement is also something which has been agreed to between the parties. But at some stage at least, either in the offer or in the counter proposal, the arbitration agreement must be expressly articulated, at least at some juncture. So that would be the answer in terms of whether consent is expressly required or is it something which can be presumed. I hope that answered your query, Prashast. Yeah, perfect. So any other queries in terms of what the arbitration procedure contemplates? See, I would suggest that you go through the sections once again, that if there are any clarifications on the next date, then you can put this to me. Because arbitration, as I mentioned, is something which you all have to reckon with going forward. And more than the similarities, the differences itself obviously are a matter of concern in terms of one's understanding of the system. Right. So if there are no other queries, then I think we can call it a day. Also, I will just post on the WhatsApp group, and also I will create a separate sort of a topic on the forum where you can all call dibs in terms of what your topics will be. I had no idea what the term dibs meant. I guess that's also an indicator of how old I have become, but I had to look it up online. So I guess dibs means you will choose what you want to, first come, first serve. So yeah, so therefore you can just call dibs on the topics, and then I think depending on whether they actually fit in with the overall theme of the course, we can continue with that. And I'll also post that on the group, but I would effectively want the drafts to come to me at least by the 20th of October, so that I have sufficient time to be able to check them and then pass on the marks to the examination branch. So I'll mention all of this in the forums, and I'll also put that on the WhatsApp group. Perfect. So I'll see all of you guys on Sunday then. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.